Were you scouting?
I wasn't scouting, I was following the path the woman in my dreams told me will lead me home.
The cold, untouchable world of Marcello Virelli is about to be shattered by a ghost from his past. As the powerful mafia boss leans across his desk to interrogate a mysterious young trespasser, a single silver bowl of almonds triggers a life-or-death reaction that changes everything. When the light hits her neck, revealing the legendary crimson mark, identical to his own, a decade of lies begins to unravel. Watch until the very end to see the shocking moment Marcello realizes his greatest enemy isn't an outside rival, but the person he trusted most. You won't want to miss the final transformation of a man who goes from a ruthless kingpin to a father willing to burn his entire empire down to save his daughter. If you're ready for a story of betrayal, bloodlines, and ultimate redemption, make sure to like this video and subscribe so you never miss a chapter of this gritty underworld thriller. The silence in the study was suffocating as Marcello watched the girl, Narina, slowly regain her composure. The wheezing had subsided, but the air remained charged with a tension that felt like a physical weight. Behind her, the two enforcers stood like granite statues, their faces masks of professional indifference, though Marcello could sense the subtle shift in their breathing. He didn't look at them. His eyes were still locked on the jagged reddish mark on the girl's neck. "Enzo," Marcello said, his voice a low, dangerous rasp that didn't match the tremor in his hands beneath the desk. "Tell me exactly where you found her." Enzo, the taller of the two, stepped forward into the pool of light. "She was at the edge of the north perimeter, boss. Near the old willow tree by the creek." Marcello's heart skipped. That was the spot where his wife, Sophia, used to take their daughter before the fire, a place no stranger would ever think to look. She tripped a silent alarm when she climbed the stone wall. "We thought she was a scout for the D'Amico family, maybe a distraction. She didn't have a bag, no ID, nothing but that denim jacket and a look of total confusion." Narina looked up at Marcello, her large, curious eyes shimmering with a mix of fear and an odd, haunting familiarity. "I wasn't scouting," she whispered, her voice small but steady. "I was following the path. The woman in my dreams told me that if I followed the water to the big house, I'd finally be home." The room seemed to tilt. Marcello felt a cold sweat break across his brow. He was a man who had built a kingdom on the corpses of those who dared to lie to him, a man who relied on fear to maintain his legacy. But looking at this child, wearing the same casual denim jacket as any ordinary girl, he felt his cynicism beginning to crack. "A woman in your dreams?" Marcello asked, leaning even closer. His sharp, weathered face was inches from hers now. "She had hair like mine," Narina said, reaching up to touch the birthmark on her neck, mirroring the one Marcello hid beneath his tailored collar. "And she told me to look for the man with the silver watch and the tired eyes." Marcello glanced down at the gold watch on his wrist, the light glinting off its polished surface. He looked back at his men. "Did anyone else see her? Did my brother see her?" "Lorenzo was in the garden when we brought her through the side entrance," the second guard, Eddie, replied. "He asked why we were wasting time with a gutter rat. He told us to take her to the disposal site and be done with it." Marcello's jaw tightened until it ached. His own brother, the man who had comforted him at the funeral 8 years ago, had dismissed his own flesh and blood as a gutter rat. The conspiracy began to take shape in his mind, a web of shadows where his daughter had been hidden away while he mourned an empty grave. "She stays here," Marcello commanded, his voice echoing with an authority that left no room for debate. "In the guest suite. Double the guard on the north wing. And if my brother asks, tell him she was an orphan looking for food and that I sent her away." He looked back at Narina, seeing the soft, innocent face that defied the darkness of his world. "You're not going anywhere, little bird. Not until I find out who stole 8 years of my life." The door clicked shut, leaving Marcello alone with the girl in a room that suddenly felt far too small for the weight of the secrets it held. He stood up, his joints popping, a reminder of the 63 years he had spent hardening his soul against the world. He walked around the heavy mahogany desk, his shadow stretching long and jagged across the Persian rug. Narina didn't flinch as he approached. She simply watched him with those large, curious eyes that seemed to see right through his expensive tailored suit. "Sit," he commanded softly, gesturing to the velvet armchair. As she obeyed, Marcello reached out with a hand that had signed death warrants and crushed rivals, but now it hovered, trembling, near her jawline. He gently tilted her head to the side. Under the direct glow of the desk lamp, the birthmark was undeniable. It wasn't a mere blemish, it was a map of his own history, a deep crimson splash that mimicked the exact jagged edges of the mark hidden beneath his own collar. This was the hereditary signature of the Virelli men, a biological brand that had marked his father and his grandfather before him. Marcello felt a surge of nausea. For 8 years, he had lived in a tomb of his own making, fueled by the cold belief that his legacy had ended in a bloom of fire and twisted metal. He looked at the girl's throat, then at his own reflection in the darkened windowpane. The physical evidence was a silent scream, a freight train of realization that crashed through his carefully constructed paranoia. If the mark was real, then the grave at St. Jude's was a lie. He moved to a wall safe hidden behind a painting, his fingers flying over the keypad. From a velvet-lined box, he pulled out a heavy, ornate ring and a small, sealed envelope containing a lock of hair, the only things he had left of his daughter, or so he thought. He held the lock of light brown hair against Narina's long tresses. The match was perfect. Every fiber of his being, once dedicated to the reliance on fear and power, was now vibrating with a singular, protective instinct. "Who gave you that jacket, Narina?" he asked, his voice cracking. He touched the denim sleeve, noticing the high-quality stitching that didn't match the story of a gutter rat. "The man who brought me the food," she whispered. "He told me never to show the mark to anyone. He said it was a stain that would get me hurt." Marcello's eyes darkened to the color of flint. He knew that man. He knew the methodical, patient way his brother Lorenzo operated, keeping a pure air in a cage like a contingency plan. The impossibility of her survival was becoming a cold, tactical reality. He wasn't just looking at a child, he was looking at the evidence of a massive internal betrayal that went deeper than any arms deal or street war. Marcello leaned back, his intense expression softening for the first time in a decade, a flicker of hope for redemption sparking in the darkness of his eyes. The hunt hadn't just begun, it had become personal. The shadows in the office seemed to deepen, drawing closer as if the walls themselves were leaning in to listen. Marcello sat back in his heavy leather chair, his heart drumming a frantic rhythm against his ribs that contradicted his cold, untouchable exterior. He watched Narina, who was now tracing the gold embroidery on the arm of her chair with a small, delicate finger. The silence was no longer empty, it was heavy with the presence of the dead. "Tell me more about the woman in your dreams," Marcello prompted, his voice barely a whisper, shifting from his usual, tense and gritty, tone to something raw and vulnerable. Narina looked up, her large eyes reflecting the flickering candlelight of the study. "She used to sit by my bed when the room was dark and the bad men were shouting outside," she said softly. "She told me I was a princess hidden in a tower, and that one day, the king would find me." She paused, a small, sad smile touching her lips. She had a song to make the shadows go away. Without prompting, Narina began to hum. It was a low, melodic tune, a haunting arrangement of notes that drifted through the room like a ghost. Marcello felt the air leave his lungs. It wasn't just any melody, it was a Sicilian folk song, a lullaby Sofia had composed herself in the weeks before Narina was born. It was a secret melody, never written down, never shared with the help or even the extended family. Sofia had called it her gift of blood, a song intended only for the ears of their child. As the girl's voice grew slightly louder, the humming transformed into soft Italian lyrics, her accent perfect, her pitch mirroring the ghost that had haunted Marcello's dreams for 8 years. The atmospheric stillness of the room shattered. This was the final piece of the puzzle, an emotional anchor that dragged Marcello's cold nature toward a sudden, possible path of redemption. He realized that while he had been relying on fear and power, a piece of his soul had been surviving in the dark, kept alive by a melody and a mother's desperate love. The realization hit him with the force of a freight train. If she knew the song, Sophia hadn't just died in a fire, she had lived long enough to teach their daughter how to find her way home. His brother Lorenzo hadn't just stolen his heir, he had stolen the final years of a dying woman's life. Marcello's grip tightened on the edge of his desk until his knuckles turned white. The circle of traitors was closing in, but for the first time in a decade, the boss of the Virelli syndicate had something worth more than his empire to fight for. "Sing it again, Narina," he whispered, his eyes stinging with the first tears he had allowed himself in a lifetime. "Sing it until the shadows leave this house." The haunting echoes of the lullaby still hung in the heavy air of the study when a soft, rhythmic tapping at the door broke the trance. Marcello signaled for Narina to step into the curtained alcove of his library, his intense and suspicious gaze returning to the door as his trusted personal physician, Dr. Eris, entered. The doctor looked pale, his hands trembling slightly as he held a sealed manila envelope, the result of a clandestine DNA test Marcello had ordered using a strand of the girl's hair and his own blood. The atmosphere in the room shifted from atmospheric mystery to an urgent tactical thriller as Marcello snatched the envelope, his rugged, weathered fingers tearing at the seal with a desperation he hadn't felt in decades. The paper crinkled with a deafening roar in the silent room. Marcello's eyes scanned the technical data, bypassing the complex jargon until they landed on the final, cold statistical reality, a 99.9% match. The crimson mark on her neck wasn't a freak coincidence of nature, it was a biological certainty. Narina was his blood, his legacy, and the living evidence of a massive conspiracy that had kept his own daughter a prisoner of the shadows. The cold nature that had defined Marcello since the fire 8 years ago finally cracked under the weight of this truth, replaced by a freight train of realization about the snakes in his own garden. "The results are conclusive, Marcello," the doctor whispered, his voice thick with the danger of what he was saying. "But there is something else. The child's medical history. Whoever was keeping her had her listed under a fake name in a private clinic owned by a holding company." Marcello's jaw tightened as the doctor handed him a second sheet of paper. At the bottom of the clinic's incorporation papers was a signature he recognized instantly, Lorenzo Virelli. The betrayal was no longer a suspicion, it was a documented fact. His brother, the man who had stood by him at an empty grave, had been methodical and patient, dismantling Marcello's peace while keeping the true heir as a secret pawn. The stakes had evolved from a simple trespassing incident into a life-or-death situation for the entire Virelli organization. Marcello looked toward the alcove where his daughter was hidden, his reliance on fear transforming into a singular, protective goal to safeguard the child from the man he had called brother. The kingpin was dead, the father had finally woken up, and he realized that to keep Narina safe, he would have to evaluate every man in his circle of traitors before the cleaning house began. The air in the grand dining hall felt thinner than usual, poisoned by the massive conspiracy that now occupied every corner of Marcello's mind. Across the long, candlelit table sat Lorenzo, his younger brother, who was swirling a glass of vintage Barolo with a relaxed elegance that Marcello now recognized as the mask of a methodical and patient predator. Marcello watched him through intense and suspicious eyes, his rugged face a stone wall of indifference while his heart burned with the knowledge of the 99.9% match tucked away in his study safe. "You seem distant tonight, Marcello," Lorenzo remarked, his voice smooth and devoid of the guilt that should have been rotting his soul. The guards mentioned a small disturbance at the perimeter. "A trespasser?" Marcello felt the climax of tension rising in his chest, but he forced a slow, cold smile. He was no longer just a boss. He was a man evaluating his circle of traitors, and Lorenzo was at the very center. A beggar child, Lorenzo. Looking for scraps. "I had the men toss her back to the streets," Marcello lied, the words tasting like ash. He watched for a flicker of relief in Lorenzo's eyes, a subtle tell, and he saw it. A momentary softening of the jaw, a brief break in the younger man's emotional armor. The tactical thriller was now in full motion. Marcello realized that his brother hadn't just been waiting for him to die. He had been dismantling the operation from the shadows, likely using Narina as the ultimate insurance policy. Every time Lorenzo spoke of family loyalty or the future of the syndicate, Marcello saw the vipers swirling in the dark. He began to shadow Lorenzo's movements through the estate's security feeds later that night, noticing how his brother frequently checked the encrypted comms on his Patek Philippe watch, the same brand worn by the ghosts of the past. The stakes had never been higher. If Marcello moved too soon, he would lead the cleaners straight to the girl hidden in the north wing. He had to play the part of the cold, untouchable boss for a few hours more, even as his flaw of reliance on fear was being replaced by a desperate, protective love. As Lorenzo stood to retire for the evening, Marcello stayed in the shadows of the hall, watching his brothers retreating back. The man who had faked a deceased family's end was about to find out that Marcello Virelli was no longer listening to the powerless. He was becoming their most dangerous protector. The stillness of the north wing was shattered not by a scream, but by the rhythmic, muffled thud of suppressed gunfire echoing through the stone corridors. Marcello had been watching the monitors in the darkness of his study when the cleaning house officially began. The grainy black and white feed showed three shadows moving with tactical precision, men who didn't wear the colors of the D'Amico rivals, but the standard-issue tactical gear of his own elite security. Lorenzo had moved faster than anticipated, realizing the gutter rat hadn't been disposed of and was now a threat to his orchestrated takeover. Marcello burst into the guest suite just as the window glass sprayed across the floor in a diamond-like rain. Nerina was huddled beneath the heavy oak bed, her eyes wide with a quiet bravery that mirrored his own in the face of death. He didn't hesitate. His cold nature had fully shifted into that of a protective predator. He scooped her up, the denim of her jacket rough against his tailored suit, and ducked behind the reinforced wardrobe just as a hail of lead shredded the silk pillows where she had been sleeping moments before. "Stay behind me, little bird," Marcello growled, his voice a low rasp of intense authority. He pulled a heavy beretta from his waistband, his rugged, weathered hands steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. This wasn't just an underworld war anymore. It was a life-or-death situation for the legacy he had just rediscovered. As the first assassin kicked in the bedroom door, Marcello fired with a methodical accuracy that left no room for mercy. The man crumpled, but two more were already stacking up in the hallway. The pacing of the night had accelerated into a tactical thriller. Marcello knew the estate was compromised. The circle of traitors was larger than he had feared. He led Nerina through a concealed servants' passage, the narrow stone walls damp and smelling of age. Behind them, he could hear the heavy boots of the cleaners and the cold, calm voice of Lorenzo over the tactical comms, ordering his men to ensure no witnesses remain. Marcello reached the heavy iron door of the sub-basement safe house, his breath coming in sharp, ragged hitches. He shoved Nerina inside the reinforced bunker, his eyes meeting hers for a fleeting second. For the first time, the Mafia kingpin felt a genuine hope for redemption. He wasn't just fighting for an empire of blood and cash anymore, he was fighting for the girl with the crimson mark. As he slammed the steel bolts into place, locking himself outside to face the oncoming shadows, he realized that the cold, untouchable boss was dead. Only the father remained, and he was ready to burn everything down to keep the ghost of his past alive. The heavy steel door of the bunker hummed with the distant vibration of the chaos above, but inside, the air was still and thick with the scent of old gunpowder and concrete. Marcello leaned against the cold wall, his rugged, weathered face illuminated by the dim emergency red light. He looked at Nerina, who sat on a wooden crate, her denim jacket dusty and her large, curious eyes, watching his every move with a quiet bravery that both impressed and devastated him. He realized that in his world, innocence was a luxury she could no longer afford. "Look at me, Nerina," Marcello said, his voice dropping to a low, intense rasp. He knelt before her, his gold watch glinting in the crimson shadows. "In this life, the people who want to hurt you don't always look like monsters. They look like shadows in a rearview mirror. They look like the man standing too long at a shop window." He was no longer just a mafia kingpin. He was a teacher passing on the wisdom from the streets. He pulled a small handheld monitor from the wall, showing the grainy feeds of the estate's outer perimeter. When we move, you don't look at the faces. You look at the patterns, he explained, pointing to a black sedan idling at a junction. See how he stays 3 cars back? See how he doesn't turn his lights on? That is his tail. They are methodical and patient, just like the man who sent them. He was teaching her how to listen to the dangers that the powerless usually ignored. Narina leaned in, her small hand brushing against the crimson mark on her neck as she studied the screen. Is that why you have so many cameras, Marcello? Because you're always being followed. The question hit him with the force of a freight train. He had spent 63 years building a kingdom of paranoia, only to realize his flaw was relying so much on fear and power that he hadn't seen the vipers in his own home. I have them because I was afraid, he admitted, a rare moment of redemption cracking his emotional armor. But now, I use them to make sure you never have to be. He stood up, checking the action on his Beretta. The pacing was about to accelerate again. We are leaving the estate. I'm going to show you how to disappear. If you see a car stay behind us through 3 turns, you tell me. If you see a man touch his ear when we walk past, you run. Do you understand? Narina nodded, her expression showing confusion and quiet bravery. She reached out and took his hand, her small fingers disappearing inside his calloused grip. The transformation was complete. The cold, untouchable boss was now a man with a purpose higher than any arms deal. As they prepared to step out into the tactical thriller of the night, Marcello knew the hunt was no longer about his empire, it was about her survival. The midnight air at St. Jude's Cemetery was thick with a tense, cinematic and gritty fog that clung to the weathered headstones. Marcello stood before the marble monument of his wife, Sophia, his rugged, weathered face illuminated by the rhythmic sweep of a flashlight held by his most loyal driver. Beside him, Narina gripped the hem of her denim jacket, her large, curious eyes reflecting the flickering shadows of the graveyard. For 8 years, this plot of land had been the epicenter of Marcello's coldness and reliance on fear, a place where he came to bury his heart. But the wisdom from the streets and the crimson mark on the girl's neck had turned his sanctuary into a crime scene. Start digging, Marcello commanded, his voice a low, intense rasp that brooked no argument. The pacing of the night felt like a slow-motion nightmare as the shovels bit into the damp earth, the sound echoing like a heartbeat in the silence. He was methodical and patient, just like the brother who had betrayed him, but his purpose was now rooted in a possible path of redemption. Every scoop of dirt removed was a layer of Lorenzo's massive conspiracy being stripped away. The shovel finally struck wood with a hollow, sickening thud. The climax of tension reached a breaking point as Marcello descended into the pit, his gold watch glinting in the dirt as he pried at the lid of the casket. He had expected to find the remains of his life. Instead, as the lid groaned open, the flashlight revealed nothing but heavy bags of sand and a collection of bricks weighted to simulate a body. The deceased wife he had mourned was a ghost of Lorenzo's making. Marcello looked up from the empty grave, his eyes stinging with a mixture of cold nature and fresh, hot rage. The stakes were no longer just about survival, they were about the 8 years of life stolen from him and the woman who might still be out there, hidden in another of Lorenzo's cages. He reached out of the pit, taking Narina's hand with a firm, protective grip. The outcome and transformation was now absolute. He wasn't just a mafia kingpin anymore. He was a man who had seen the bottom of his own grave and decided to climb out. "Your mother isn't here, Narina," he whispered, his emotional armor finally shattering in the moonlight. "And your uncle is going to wish he had stayed in the shadows." The hunt had moved from the defensive to a total offensive as they left the hollow grave behind, heading toward the final confrontation that would either restore his family or end his empire forever. The finale of the Virelli legacy unfolded at Pier 17, a desolate stretch of concrete where the massive arms shipment was docked, its hull casting a long, jagged shadow over the proceedings. Marcello stood in the center of the docks, his rugged, weathered face illuminated by the harsh industrial floodlights. In one hand he held a heavy leather satchel containing the digital keys to his entire empire, the accounts, the routes, and the $3 million deal that served as his crown. In the other, he gripped the hand of Narina, whose quiet bravery was the only thing keeping him grounded in this circle of traitors. Lorenzo stepped out of the darkness, flanked by rigid and watchful guards who had once been Marcello's own men. He looked at the satchel with a methodical and patient hunger, his Patek Philippe watch glinting as he checked the time. "A king without a kingdom, Marcello," Lorenzo mocked, his voice smooth despite the tense, cinematic atmosphere. "All this for a gutter rat?" "She is a Virelli." Marcello's voice was a low, intense rasp that echoed off the shipping containers. "And you are nothing but a thief of ghosts." The climax of tension reached its peak as Marcello slid the satchel across the oil-stained pavement. This was the king's sacrifice, the moment he traded his reliance on fear and power for a possible path of redemption. As Lorenzo reached for the bag, Marcello signaled to a silent figure in the crane above, a loyalist who hadn't been bought. Instead of a firefight, a massive container of scrap metal was released, crashing onto the armored transport behind Lorenzo, cutting off his escape and creating a freight train of chaos. In the confusion, Marcello didn't reach for his gun. He scooped Narina up and ran toward the small motorboat idling at the edge of the pier. Behind them, the sounds of his former empire burning filled the air. Lorenzo had the crown, but the crown was now a target for every rival family Marcello had ever suppressed. By taking the leadership, Lorenzo had inherited a war he wasn't prepared to win. As the boat sped away from the cleaning house on the docks, Marcello looked at the girl with the crimson mark. The outcome and transformation was absolute. He had lost his wealth, his men, and his throne, but as Narina leaned her head against his shoulder, he felt a weight lift that he had carried for 8 years. The mafia kingpin was dead, but for the first time, the father was truly home.